Rain hammered the streets of Nice like a relentless drum, drenching everything in its path, turning narrow alleys into rushing rivers, carrying bits of mud, leaves and broken pieces of paper that swirled around Lila Grace's tiny feet. Barefoot and trembling, the 7-year-old clutched her worn, tattered teddy bear close to her chest, as if it were the only thing in the world protecting her from the storm, from the darkness, from the cruelty that seemed to follow her at every step. Her golden hair, plastered to her small cheeks, was streaked with mud and rain, and her wide, terrified eyes darted from shadow to shadow, from puddle to puddle, scanning for the next threat, the next hand that might push her to the ground or steal the little she had left. Victor Kane's voice had not yet faded from her ears, the cruel laughter, the harsh shove that had sent her sprawling into the muck, the words echoing in her mind. Worthless, street rat, nothing. The sting of mud on her skin, the ache in her legs, the relentless cold of the storm, it was all unbearable, yet she forced herself to run, each step a desperate act of survival, each breath a reminder that giving up was never an option, that somewhere, somehow, there might still be safety, a place where she could hide from the world's cruelty, even if only for a night. Her little hands, raw and scraped from the journey, gripped the teddy bear so tightly it creaked under her grasp, and with every step her soaked dress clung to her, heavy and suffocating, but she did not stop, could not stop, because stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant returning to the man's harsh grip, or being swallowed by the storm. And then she saw it, a towering gate, wrought iron glistening with raindrops, standing like a sentinel at the edge of a strange, impossible world. Beyond it rose a mansion so large, so untouchably grand, that Lila barely dared to believe her eyes. Lights glimmered against the wet stone walls, reflecting off puddles to create a halo of warmth in the otherwise gray, chaotic night. She stumbled toward it, mud squelching beneath her small feet, tears mixing freely with rain as her trembling lips whispered the words she barely dared to voice, her voice quivering, but filled with the kind of desperate hope only a child who has known hunger, fear, and rejection can muster. Please, just a corner in the doghouse. I'll be quiet. I swear I won't make a sound. Her voice carried through the storm, fragile yet piercing, reaching walls that had never known such a sound, reaching a world she had never entered, reaching a man who had never known the pull of raw need before him. Inside the mansion, Damian Hale sat at a sleek, polished desk, the rain drumming on the glass windows behind him, reviewing contracts with a precision born of years spent mastering the language of power, of money, of business deals that could change cities and fortunes in a single signature. Every line of his face was calm, practiced, disciplined, a mask of focus perfected over decades of navigating the highest stakes. Yet when the faint, trembling voice of the child reached his ears, slicing through the rhythm of his life like a sudden, sharp note in a symphony, something in him shifted, halted, recoiled. Not contracts, not wealth, not influence. This was a need he could not ignore, a plea so fragile and human it forced the air from his lungs, made his heart beat faster in ways no business challenge ever had. He rose, pausing as the sound of the storm mixed with the child's whispered words, their innocence and terror forming a tapestry of emotion he had spent a lifetime avoiding, shielding himself from. He had walked past countless problems, negotiated over boards and billion-dollar deals, but never, not once, had he encountered this kind of helplessness, this raw and exposed vulnerability that demanded attention, demanded action, demanded a response he was not sure he was ready to give. Outside, Lila pressed herself against the wrought iron, drenched to the bone, shivering violently, the cold biting her arms and legs like tiny knives. Her little frame trembled, not just from the storm, but from the uncertainty that gnawed at her. Would he turn her away, slam the door in her face, leave her to the elements and the memory of Victor Kane's cruelty? She whispered again, almost inaudibly, as though the words themselves might protect her. Please, anyone. I don't have anywhere else. Her breath fogged in the cold air, mingling with the mist rising from the puddles, and somewhere in her chest, a fragile hope flickered, small but insistent, refusing to be snuffed out by fear. Damian paused at the doorway, staring at the tiny soaked figure. He saw her mud-streaked face, the wide, pleading eyes, the hands clutching the ragged teddy bear, and felt something stir within him, a long dormant part of his soul he had forgotten existed, a need to protect, to care, to shelter, stronger than any boardroom ambition, stronger than any deal he had ever closed. The mansion, with all its walls, its power, its cold elegance, suddenly felt empty and irrelevant in comparison to this one small life trembling at his gate. He thought of the contracts he had been reviewing, the meetings in Geneva, the endless calculations, and realized that none of it mattered, not in this moment, not when a child's life, her safety, her very being, hung in the balance of a decision he could make in a single step. The storm raged on, indifferent to their presence, lashing rain against the stone walls, sending sheets of water down the driveway and soaking everything it touched. Lila's small figure quivered against the gate, and Damian's hand hovered over the doorknob, frozen not by hesitation, but by the weight of humanity pressing down on him, the gravity of responsibility that no amount of money or power could alleviate. He had spent years controlling the world, mastering every variable, yet this was unpredictable, raw, uncontrollable, and it demanded all of him. He could ignore her, he could walk back inside and pretend the world was orderly, safe, distant, but something in his chest twisted, a mix of longing, guilt, and a sudden piercing awareness that the right choice was to step out into the storm, to act, to offer warmth, to offer shelter, to offer hope to a life that had known so little. And so he moved, one careful, measured step forward, coat brushing against rain-slick stone, eyes never leaving her small, trembling form. Every heartbeat sounded deafening in his ears, every second stretched, the storm amplifying both fear and anticipation. Lila, sensing movement, looked up, her tear-streaked face meeting his gaze, and in that instant, a connection sparked, a thread of understanding, compassion, and unspoken promise that bridged their worlds. Damian spoke, voice steady but gentle, carrying through the storm. "Little one, you can't stay out here. Not tonight. Not ever." The words, simple yet heavy with meaning, settled over the drenched courtyard like a protective blanket. Lila's lips trembled, a faint hope flickering in her eyes, and she whispered back, her voice barely audible over the rain, Thank you." For the first time in decades, Damian Hale felt the storm inside him calm, replaced by a resolve to do more than just protect her tonight. This was no longer a moment of chance, but a moment of choice, one that would ripple through both their lives in ways he could not yet imagine. The mansion loomed behind him, vast and untouchable, but outside, in the rain, a small girl with golden hair and a worn teddy bear had just begun to teach a billionaire the first lesson he had never learned, the immeasurable value of compassion, kindness, and humanity. Would Damian simply give her a corner in the doghouse and retreat, or would he take the first step toward a bond that could change both their lives forever? Damian stepped fully onto the wet driveway, the rain soaking his tailored coat, the fabric clinging slightly to his shoulders, yet nothing compared to the cold shock of seeing Lila Grace's tiny form shivering in the storm, soaked to the bone, clutching her ragged teddy bear as though it were the only anchor keeping her tethered to hope. He could see every detail now, the trembling of her small hands, the desperate curve of her lips, the way her wide, frightened eyes searched him as if he might be her last chance at safety in a world that had offered her nothing but cruelty, abandonment, and pain. And for a moment, Damian felt the strange, almost unbearable weight of responsibility settle on his chest, heavier than any financial ledger, heavier than any negotiation he had ever undertaken, because this was not a contract he could walk away from, not a deal he could postpone, not a number he could adjust, but a living, breathing child whose very existence demanded protection, compassion, and courage. And he realized with sudden clarity that every decision he had made in his life, every empire he had built, every achievement, every carefully maintained facade, meant nothing compared to the raw, urgent, undeniable humanity in front of him. He crouched slightly, lowering himself to meet her gaze, though he kept a careful distance, unsure if proximity would frighten her further, or offer the comfort she clearly needed. And Lila's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear, wonder, and a flicker of hope so fragile it almost broke his heart, because in them, Damian saw not only vulnerability, but a resilience that belied her 7 years, a tiny spark of determination to survive that refused to be extinguished despite the mud, the rain, the cruel hand of Victor Kane, and all the nights she had spent wondering if anyone would ever care. He swallowed hard, his throat tight, and spoke again, softer this time, almost a whisper carried over the rain's fury. "I can't let you stay out here, not in this storm, not ever." And Lila's lips quivered, tears threatening to spill again, but she nodded, clutching the teddy bear closer as though it might shield her from both the elements and the uncertainty of the billionaire's words, her small voice rising barely above the patter of rain as she said, I won't make a sound, I have nowhere else to go." Damian felt an ache, unfamiliar and profound, a tug in his chest that no amount of money, success, or power had ever created. A call to action that bypassed logic and commanded him to act, to offer warmth, shelter, and reassurance, to become more than the calculated, untouchable figure the world had always seen him as, and without fully realizing it, he extended a gloved hand, hesitated a heartbeat, then beckoned her toward the doorway. The entrance to his mansion suddenly transformed from a symbol of isolation and wealth into a potential sanctuary where safety, hope, and a new beginning could take root. Lila's small steps toward him were tentative, each one an act of courage, her soaked dress clinging to her, each breath a puff of mist in the cold night air, and Damian's heart pounded, aware that the slightest misstep, a harsh word, or even a pause could shatter the fragile trust forming between them, that he held in his hands not only a child's safety, but the first fragile threads of a connection that might yet change both of their lives forever. As they reached the threshold, Damian opened the massive wooden door fully, letting the warm, dry air of the mansion spill onto the storm-soaked driveway, and for a moment, Lila froze, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from the harsh, punishing night to the soft glow of lamplight, the subtle scent of polished wood and leather, and the quiet hum of a home that had never known a visitor like her before, a place where laughter, warmth, and care might still exist, if only she could believe in it. Damian guided her inside carefully, not touching her unless she allowed it, aware that consent and trust were as important now as the shelter he offered, and she whispered, "Thank you. I didn't know anyone would care," her voice cracking with the weight of years spent in neglect, and Damian felt an unfamiliar lump in his throat, realizing that his world of contracts and power had never prepared him for the gravity of this human connection, the sheer magnitude of being able to save someone not because he had to, but because he could, because his heart demanded it. He led her to a small sitting area near the fireplace, warm blankets waiting in anticipation, though he didn't tell her how long they would stay, allowing the environment to feel like her choice as much as his protection. And Lila sank to the floor, wrapping the teddy bear tightly against her chest, shivering less now, glancing up at Damian with a mixture of awe, relief, and cautious curiosity, as though trying to read whether this man who could command empires could also understand compassion. Damian, meanwhile, observed her with a new kind of attention, noting the way her tiny fingers clutched the bear, the slight tremor in her shoulders, the way her eyes held a story of survival far beyond her age, and he realized that his life, once meticulously ordered and unyielding, had just been irrevocably altered by a single human being, one who had no power in the world except for the sheer force of innocence and the courage to ask for help. And that realization, heavy and electrifying, pulsed through him with every heartbeat, making him question not only his priorities, but the very walls he had built around his own emotions. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, wind and rain colliding with the mansion walls, the night alive with the chaos of nature, yet inside, a fragile calm had settled. A tense, delicate balance between the stranger and the child, between fear and safety, and Damian knew that this night would mark the beginning of something neither of them could yet comprehend, a journey of trust, care, and slowly blooming affection that would test both his patience and his heart in ways he had never anticipated. As Lila finally curled against the blankets, exhaustion pulling her toward sleep, Damian quietly set the firewood beside the hearth, the crackle of flames filling the room with warmth and soft light, a contrast to the storm that still raged outside, and he realized that his role was now clear. Protector, guardian, and perhaps, unknowingly, a friend to someone who needed him more than he had ever needed anyone himself. He stood by the doorway for a long moment, watching her drift into a fragile, uneven sleep, heart heavy with emotion, mind racing with questions about what dangers might still be out there, what Victor Kane's next move would be, and whether Lila Grace's trust in him would endure the coming trials. Yet a small, undeniable hope blossomed within him, fragile but potent, like the first spark of dawn breaking over a long, stormy night, signaling that the impossible might just be possible, that two lives, so vastly different and yet inextricably linked by fate, could begin to heal and change together. And as Damian finally allowed himself to exhale, the firelight flickering against his face, he realized that tonight, a single act of kindness, a single choice to open his door, had set in motion a chain of events that neither he nor Lila could yet fully imagine, a story of courage, trust, and the transformative power of humanity and care, and he knew that whatever happened next, he could not, would not, turn back. Would Damian's protection be enough to shield Lila from the dangers still lurking in the storm, or would her past and Victor Kane's cruelty catch up to them before morning? Damian stepped carefully into the garden, his polished shoes sinking slugishly into the soft, rain-sodden grass, the night air thick with the scent of wet earth and roses weighed down by the storm, while Lila Grace followed hesitantly behind him, her small frame trembling not just from the cold, but from the uncertainty of what awaited her outside the mansion's walls, her little hands gripping the soaked teddy bear as if it could shield her from both the rain and the unknown intentions of the world. And as they moved deeper into the garden, Damian's eyes fell upon a small, weathered doghouse tucked behind a cluster of ivy, its wooden planks worn by years of sun, rain, and neglect, yet miraculously dry under its sloped roof, a modest shelter that suddenly represented everything to Lila in that moment. Warmth, safety, a fragile promise that she might survive the night without further harm, and her eyes widened as she sank to her knees, peering inside the small space with a mix of wonder and relief, realizing that even this humble refuge might be a lifeline, a temporary haven in a world that had shown her little kindness. While Damian knelt beside her, his presence both comforting and commanding, sensing the delicate balance between offering protection and allowing her agency, careful not to frighten her further yet determined to ensure she would be safe, and as he spoke, his voice low but firm, he offered instructions that were more than practical. They were a reassurance, a human connection he had never known he could give. "Stay here tonight, I'll check on you, I promise you're safe for now." And Lila's lips quivered as gratitude flickered across her tear-streaked face, the faintest smile breaking through the exhaustion and fear, and she murmured her acceptance, crawling into the tiny doghouse, curling up tightly as if trying to merge with the shelter itself, the fabric of her soaked dress sticking to her skin, her shivers slowly easing as she pressed the teddy bear closer to her chest, while Damian lingered outside, standing in the rain that no longer felt entirely oppressive, watching her with a complex swirl of emotions, concern, fascination, and a deep, unfamiliar warmth that filled a void he hadn't realized existed. A warmth that made the weight of his empire, the billions, the deals, and the relentless schedules seem suddenly trivial, as if none of it mattered compared to ensuring this small life endured, and he thought, almost to himself, a whisper carried on the stormy wind. Why does a little girl's survival feel more urgent than any contract, more pressing than any fortune I have ever controlled? The question lingered, heavy with meaning, pressing on his mind, and as he turned to leave, a shadow passed across the garden's edge, a subtle movement that made his heart clench, a lingering reminder that Victor Kane had not relented, that the threat from her past, from cruelty that had chased her through alleys and mud-soaked streets, was still very real, still waiting, still watching, and Damian's gaze hardened, resolve settling into every line of his face, because now this was no longer a matter of charity or sympathy, it was protection, it was survival, and it was a promise he would not break. The night pressed on, dark clouds swallowing the moon, but inside the small doghouse, Lila pressed herself tightly against the wooden walls, listening to the rain's relentless rhythm, feeling the faint tremor of her own heartbeat beginning to slow under Damian's watchful eye, a fragile sense of security starting to take root even amidst the storm, while Damian moved back toward the mansion, every step measured, calculating the ways he could safeguard her, every instinct sharpened, a silent oath forming in his mind to shield her from whatever danger might emerge, the wind carrying faint whispers of past horrors she had endured, and he vowed silently that no one, Not Victor Kane, not the cruel world outside, would ever touch her again as long as he could prevent it. And in that resolve, he felt an unfamiliar stirring. A bond forming that went beyond mere duty, a connection born of necessity, empathy, and the inexplicable pull of caring for a life so vulnerable that his own heart refused to ignore it. And he realized that this small, fragile girl, soaked and shivering in a doghouse, had managed to crack the armor he had built around himself for decades, that her existence had challenged the cold, precise man he had trained himself to be, forcing him to confront compassion, kindness, and the reality that wealth could never buy the kind of fulfillment that came from protecting and nurturing a life so precious. Every flicker of lightning illuminated her small frame huddled in the doghouse, and Damian's mind raced with strategies to fortify her shelter, to prepare for threats, to anticipate Victor Kane's next move, while simultaneously, he felt an almost irrational sense of pride and hope swelling in his chest, a tiny spark that perhaps, against all odds, the night could end with her safe, warm and still believing in the possibility of goodness, and he promised himself that no discomfort, no inconvenience, no fear would stop him from honoring that promise, because Lila Grace had survived long enough to teach him that true power was not in money, not in influence, but in protecting those who could not protect themselves, and that realization lit a fire in him more potent than any deal ever had, a fire that whispered that his life, his choices, and his empire would now always be measured against this single, undeniable truth. The life of a child in peril was worth more than anything he had ever achieved, and as the night deepened, as rain streaked the garden and wind howled around the edges of the mansion, Damian Hale stood vigil, a silent guardian, heart swelling with the unfamiliar but undeniable force of love, care, and responsibility, aware that the challenges were far from over, that Victor Kane's shadow still lingered, and that this fragile connection might yet be the most important thing he had ever encountered, a bond that would shape both their futures in ways neither could yet imagine. And yet, as he watched her curled inside the doghouse, her small chest rising and falling with tentative calm, he allowed himself a quiet, fleeting hope that tonight, for the first time, a little girl would sleep safely, protected by someone who had finally learned what it meant to truly care. Would Victor Kane find her despite the shelter? Or would Damian's vigilance be enough to protect Lila through the stormy night? Morning broke over the mansion, pale sunlight struggling through heavy clouds, but the warmth of the day brought no comfort to Damian Hale as he stepped into the garden and froze. The doghouse that had held Lila Grace safely through the storm now stood empty, the blankets damp and scattered, the faint imprint of her small body gone, and a surge of panic clawed at him, sharp and urgent, a physical ache in his chest that left him momentarily breathless, heart hammering in a rhythm fueled by fear and guilt, as though the entire world had condensed into this one terrifying, impossible moment. He called her name softly at first, almost hoping she might appear, her tiny form emerging from the shadows, shivering but safe. Yet the only response was the faint whisper of the wind through the trees, the rustle of leaves, the distant city stirring, indifferent to the crisis unfolding in his garden, and with each passing second, Damian's mind raced through worst-case scenarios, the streets, the alleys, Victor Kane's cruel hands hunting her relentlessly, and he felt the sharp bite of helplessness he had never known in his meticulously controlled life, because no contract, no security system, no wealth could simply guarantee the safety of this small, vulnerable child. His steps quickened, scanning every inch of the garden, the hedges, the fountain, each shadow a potential hiding place, while the sun glinted off the polished stone of the mansion, and did nothing to warm the chill settling deep in his chest. And then, like a blade cutting through the fragile calm, Damian saw him. Victor Kane, standing at the mansion gates, the towering bearded figure radiating menace, eyes cold and calculating, hands clenched, as if the girl were a mere object he had every intention of reclaiming, his voice carrying across the distance with authority, threat, and cruelty intertwined. "Where is she, Hale? That girl belongs to me." And Damian's usual composed, measured demeanor shattered, a storm matching the one from the night before raging inside him, as he realized that protection could not be passive, that Lila was more than a fleeting responsibility or a temporary burden. She was a spark of life, a force capable of stirring feelings in him that he had buried under years of power, ambition, and solitude, and the thought of failing her, of letting her slip from his grasp into Victor Kane's hands, made him feel hollow in a way that no financial loss or business failure ever had. He strode forward, voice low but unwavering, a steel-hard edge mixing with the warmth of human care. "She is under my protection, you will not touch her." Yet even as he spoke, a creeping realization gnawed at him. This was not simply about tonight, about the doghouse, about the storm. It was about a past he didn't understand, a web of secrets surrounding the girl, fragments of whispers he had overheard from his staff hinting at hidden inheritances, mysterious guardians, dangers lurking in her family's shadows, and for the first time, Damian faced the possibility that Lila Grace's life intersected with forces far larger and more perilous than he had ever imagined, that her existence held a significance beyond the immediate, beyond his immediate protection, and that Victor Kane was only the first of many obstacles in a game that was already underway. Damian, as pulse quickened, calculating not deals, but strategies for safeguarding her, every instinct telling him that hesitation would cost her dearly, and yet beneath the adrenaline, beneath the tactical mind racing with security, escape routes, and possible allies, there was something else, an undeniable bond forming, a fragile human connection that refused to be ignored, that whispered of warmth, empathy, and responsibility, that pulled him toward choices he had long avoided, the kind that mattered far more than wealth or power. Inside the mansion, staff whispered in hushed tones, exchanging glances that betrayed a mixture of fear and curiosity, murmuring that Lila might be more than she appeared, that her past held secrets, perhaps an inheritance kept from the world, perhaps ties to dangers unknown, perhaps the kind of mystery that could change the course of lives far beyond hers and Damian's, and the weight of these possibilities settled on Damian's shoulders like a mantle heavier than any he had carried before, forcing him to acknowledge that to truly protect her, he could no longer remain the detached, calculating man the world knew, that involvement had to be complete, absolute, unwavering, and that the man who had spent decades building empires now faced a challenge that no power or influence could solve. A child's life, fragile and precious, entangled with shadowed threats, and a villain whose cunning and cruelty were only hinted at in every stride, every word, every glance. The tension in the air was palpable, the storm from the previous night now mirrored by the storm in Damian's mind, the realization that failure was unthinkable clashing with the unknown depths of danger, and he thought of Lila, small, shivering, innocent, unaware of the forces converging around her, and felt an almost sacred duty swell in his chest, a calling that transcended business, wealth, and pride, demanding courage, ingenuity, and heart, demanding that he act fully, decisively, without hesitation, because every second he delayed was another second she was vulnerable. Another second Victor Kane could strike, and as he stepped toward the gates, eyes locked on the bearded figure, the sun breaking through the clouds in faint streaks, Damian realized that the stakes were far higher than he had ever anticipated. That Lila Grace was more than a child in need. She was a key to something larger, a spark that could ignite forces beyond their comprehension, and that protecting her meant not just shielding her from immediate harm, but stepping into a world of hidden dangers, inheritance, secrets, and perhaps betrayals yet to be revealed, and in that moment, Damian Hale knew that his life, his heart, and his very identity would be tested in ways no contract, no fortune, no empire could ever prepare him for, and yet, with unwavering resolve, he vowed silently to face whatever came next, to stand between Lila and the darkness, and to ensure that she would never feel helpless again, because the moment she had touched his life, she had awakened a man who had thought himself untouchable, and in protecting her, he had discovered the depth of humanity, love, and courage he never knew he possessed, and he would not, could not, let her go. How far would Victor Kane go to reclaim Lila, and what secrets lay in her past that made her worth so much more than anyone realized? Damian moved quickly through the mansion, the polished floors reflecting the morning light as he searched every corner, every room, every shadow for any sign of Lila Grace, the panic from the empty doghouse still pulsing in his chest, when finally, near the far end of the greenhouse, he spotted her, a tiny figure crouched beneath the hanging ferns, knees drawn to her chest, soaked hair plastered to her forehead, trembling not just from the cold, but from the memory of the relentless pursuit. Yet something had changed. Her wide eyes, though fearful, flickered with recognition, and when she saw Damian, a fragile trust shone through, the realization that the man who had offered her shelter, warmth, and protection truly cared, and she whispered, voice barely audible over the soft rustle of leaves, "You saved me." And Damian felt a pang so sharp it left him breathless, because in that small, trembling voice, he recognized something far deeper than gratitude. He saw the reflection of a child abandoned by the world, a mirror to parts of himself he had long buried, a piece of humanity he had forgotten existed amidst the empire of contracts, money, and cold logic he had spent decades constructing. He extended a gentle hand, careful not to frighten her further, and guided her from the shadows of the greenhouse to the warmth of his private library, a sanctuary unlike anything she had ever known, walls lined with books that smelled of time and wisdom, a fire crackling softly in the hearth casting golden light across polished shelves, and for the first time in her young life, Lila Grace could feel the world soften around her, a warmth that was not just heat but kindness, care, and protection. And as she curled into a blanket on a cushioned chair, clutching her teddy bear, Damian sat opposite her, letting silence linger for a moment, feeling the profound gravity of the trust she had placed in him, the fragility of her small body against the dangers that had chased her, and the weight of responsibility pressing against his chest in a way that no boardroom ordeal ever had. The two shared stories as the fire flickered, Lila's voice gaining strength, painting vivid pictures of dreams she had never dared to voice aloud, imaginations of schools she wished she could attend, friends she longed for, skies she wanted to run under without fear, and Damian listened, captivated not only by the resilience in her words, but by the untainted kindness and innocence that shone through every sentence, realizing that this child, whom the world had deemed worthless, carried within her a force more powerful than wealth, more enduring than ambition, more real than anything he had ever known. And as she spoke, he found himself reflecting, a mirror moment that cut deep, his own childhood, filled with privilege yet utterly devoid of warmth, guidance, and the sense of safety that every child deserved. And the ache that rose in his chest was a reminder that he had failed in ways he could never forgive. Yet here, in the fragile trust of a small girl, he had a chance not only to protect, but to redeem, to restore the fragments of himself that had been lost to ambition and isolation, to find humanity again through the act of caring for someone so vulnerable, so pure, so desperately in need. Hours passed as they spoke, laughter occasionally breaking the heavy atmosphere of reflection, tears mingling with moments of awe, and Damian noticed that the firelight reflected in Lila's eyes as she recounted moments of fear, triumph, and longing, that she was slowly learning to let go, to trust, to hope, and in turn, he learned to let go of the rigid control that had dominated his life, the cold precision of his decisions, allowing for unpredictability, warmth, and compassion, the kind that could not be scheduled or calculated, only felt and acted upon. And as night deepened outside, the storm long gone but the memory lingering in every shadow and echo, Damian watched over her as she slept, her chest rising and falling with the fragile rhythm of innocence, and he realized with a quiet, almost reverent understanding that he was not only guarding her body but nurturing her spirit, and in the process, healing parts of himself that had long been thought lost, the library becoming a cocoon where fear could dissolve, hope could ignite, and the bond between them could grow, resilient and unbroken, despite the world's cruelty. And in that quiet, candlelit room filled with books, firelight, and the soft scent of old paper and lavender, Damian Hale knew that for the first time, he understood what true responsibility meant, what it meant to care so deeply that failure was unbearable, and that the smallest life, the one he had rescued from mud, rain, and cruelty, had now become a guiding force, a beacon, a reminder that humanity, love, and kindness were more precious than any empire. And as he watched her drift into dreams filled with wonder rather than fear, he allowed himself a small, private vow, to protect her, to nurture her, and to never let the darkness of the world touch her again, because she had ignited in him a flame he could not extinguish, a purpose he had never known, and a bond that would define both of their lives forever, fragile yet unbreakable, innocent yet profound. And as the night wrapped around the mansion in a velvet silence, Damian finally allowed himself to feel hope, a hope so powerful it surged through every pulse, a hope born not from wealth, not from power, but from the simple, extraordinary act of caring for another human being. And in that moment, he realized that Lila Grace had not only been saved, she had saved him, awakening the part of his soul that had long been asleep, teaching him that love, trust, and protection were forces mightier than fear, cruelty, or loneliness, and that together they could face whatever shadows lay ahead. What hidden secrets in Lila's past might surface, and how will Damian's growing bond with her stand against the dangers that still lurk beyond the mansion walls? The mansion trembled under a sudden violent knock at the gates, the echoes of Victor Kane's malicious intent slamming into Damian Hale with the force of a tempest. A stark reminder that the shadows of Lila Grace's past were far from gone, and as Damian raced to the grand windows, he saw the bearded figure leaning into the storm like a predator, calculating, relentless, every line of his body screaming ownership, cruelty, and the kind of danger that no child should ever face. And in that instant, Damian understood that this was no ordinary threat, that Victor had discovered a weapon far more insidious than brute strength, the secrets, the hidden fragments of Lila's family history, carefully manipulated, twisted to gain control over her life, over her choices, over her very existence, and the weight of it struck Damian like a physical blow, his jaw tightening, fists clenching, and a cold fire igniting in his chest, because he could no longer protect her from afar, from a distance, from the comfort of walls and security systems. This was a fight that demanded heart, courage, and relentless vigilance, and he felt it stirring deep within him, a primal instinct to shield, defend, and reclaim, knowing that failure was unthinkable, that hesitation would carry consequences neither he nor Lila could survive. And as he moved, swift, precise, yet cautious, through the mansion's corridors, the storm outside raging as if echoing the turmoil within, Lila followed, small but resolute, her trust in him a fragile but unbreakable tether. And as the first confrontation erupted near the gates, words sharp and dangerous slicing through the air, Victor revealed the cruel depth of his intentions, the way he had studied her family, twisted her past into chains, and sought to make her a pawn in schemes far larger than either of them. And Damian's mind, usually a fortress of reason and calculation, now raced with strategies born of instinct and emotion, heart and intellect colliding, because he realized protecting her meant more than shielding from physical harm. It meant dismantling lies, severing threats, and reclaiming truth for a life that had known only fear and manipulation. And amidst the chaos, Lila spoke, voice trembling yet brave, revealing the first hints of knowledge she had gathered, small, almost imperceptible clues about Damian's own lineage, about connections she had quietly pieced together, secrets that intertwined her safety with his history, her survival with his choices. And in that moment, a realization struck Damian with the force of revelation. Saving Lila was never just an act of charity or compassion, it was destiny, fate threading their lives together in ways neither could have anticipated. A bond so profound that it healed wounds long ignored, loneliness long endured, and the cold emptiness that had filled Damian's life despite wealth, power, and influence. And as they stood together in the library, the storm raging outside, walls shaking, heartbeats synchronizing, Damian felt the true depth of their trust solidify, a bond forged not just in protection but in shared courage, in revelation, in the acknowledgement that each had saved the other in ways beyond comprehension, and the intensity of the moment forced reflection. Memories of Damian's own childhood, the isolation, the unanswered questions, the quiet despair of nights spent alone in vast rooms, suddenly mirrored in the resilient, trembling eyes of Lila Grace, and the ache of recognition, of parallel struggles separated by age, but united by vulnerability and need, filled him with a determination that bordered on obsession, because he could not, would not fail her when life had already failed them both in different ways. And as Victor's threats escalated, Damian acted with a precision born of necessity and care, every command, every step, every protective instinct sharpened by love, empathy, and a sense of duty that transcended reason. while Lila, small yet brave, contributed with courage and cunning that belied her age, revealing details only a child who had suffered yet survived could know. Details that became pieces in the puzzle of safety, freedom, and truth, and through their teamwork, the immediate danger was quelled. Victor forced back, though never defeated, leaving behind the lingering promise of peril, and Damian understood that this fight, this confrontation, was on. Lie the beginning. A catalyst for the deeper truths waiting to be uncovered, the hidden threats yet unseen, and the profound, almost mystical connection between him and Lila that went far beyond protection, beyond shelter, beyond kindness. He saw clearly now that their lives were intertwined by fate itself, that she had entered his world not by accident, but to awaken something long dormant, to heal a loneliness he had never fully admitted, to teach him the boundless, redemptive power of trust, empathy, and love. And as they retreated to the sanctuary of the library, hearts pounding, clothes soaked, spirits bruised but unbroken, Damian felt a surge of clarity and purpose, knowing that protecting Lila was no longer optional. It was essential, sacred, and transformative. And as they sat together, sharing whispers and quiet breaths, he understood that the bond they had formed in the midst of chaos and revelation was unshakable, a lifeline in a world that had offered them little mercy, a force stronger than fear, cruelty, or past wounds, and that every decision, every heartbeat, every ounce of courage he could muster from that moment forward would be devoted to ensuring her safety, nurturing her trust, and embracing the destiny that had brought them together. Because in saving Lila Grace, Damian Hale had discovered not only the depth of his own capacity to care, but the extraordinary truth that love, protection, and trust were the most potent powers of all, capable of reshaping lives, healing hearts, and confronting any darkness that dared to approach. And as the storm subsided outside, leaving the night cleansed yet charged with possibility, Damian knew that the chapters of their lives were no longer separate. They were written together, threads of fate, courage, and humanity intertwined, preparing them for whatever shadows, secrets, or challenges lay ahead. How far will Victor Kane go to exploit Lila's secrets, and what hidden truths about Damian's past will come to light next? The aftermath of the storm and Victor Kane's latest assault left Damian Hale standing in the quiet of his mansion with Lila Grace clinging to his side, small fingers intertwined with his, her wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear, wonder, and tentative trust, and as he led her through the halls, every step resonating with the weight of their shared experiences, Damian realized that the fight to protect her had become far more than a battle of wealth, cunning, or brute force. It had transformed into a journey of understanding, of empathy, and of rediscovery of the emotions he had long buried beneath layers of ambition and solitude. And in the days that followed, the mansion, once cold and orderly, began to change, walls echoing with laughter that was new, fragile, yet profoundly healing, because Lila, who had entered his life trembling, barefoot, and soaked from the storm, had begun to teach him something no contract, no deal, no fortune ever could. The simple, transformative power of human connection, of care, of love, and with each morning, Damian found himself awakening not only to new responsibilities, but to a new world of experiences and emotions, sitting with Lila at the breakfast table as she spoke excitedly about the small joys of life he had forgotten, from the taste of fresh fruit to the wonder of a butterfly landing on a windowsill, and in these moments, Damian learned to slow down, to appreciate the simplicity, to find meaning in presence rather than profit, and Lila, for her part, began to emerge from the shadows of fear that had haunted her since the alleyways of Nice, her smile growing brighter, her laughter ringing clear like chimes in the mansion halls, teaching Damian that innocence, resilience, and hope could exist even amidst the darkest pasts, that trust could be nurtured carefully, patiently, and that the heart had a capacity to heal both the giver and receiver in equal measure. And as they spent days together, Damian guiding her, in lessons of manners, safety, and the etiquette of a world she had never known, he discovered that he was learning more than she, that in teaching her, he was relearning how to live, how to care, how to open his heart to vulnerability without fear, and the bond between them deepened, intertwining their lives in a delicate balance of mutual trust, protection, and affection, a bond noticed by the staff and the few close associates who occasionally saw them, whispering among themselves that the ruthless, often feared CEO Damian Hale had changed, softened, transformed, because a 7-year-old girl had reminded him of what truly mattered, that the steel and glass of his empire were no substitute for warmth, empathy, and human connection, and yet, even amidst the joy, the laughter, and the small moments of peace, the shadow of Victor Kane loomed, a reminder that the world outside their sanctuary was not fully tamed, that danger still lurked, waiting for weakness, a crack in their new-found fortress of trust and love, and Damian knew that he could never lower his guard, could never forget that Lila's past, filled with cruelty and fear, was a thread connecting to threats yet unseen, a legacy of danger that demanded constant vigilance. And as they played in the garden, the sun spilling gold across the manicured lawns, Damian watched her chase butterflies, hair glinting in the light, giggling freely, and felt a swell of emotion so powerful it brought tears to his eyes, a mixture of relief, joy, and the poignant understanding that the girl he had rescued was now rescuing him in return, awakening the compassion, tenderness, and humanity that he had thought long extinguished. And in quiet moments, sitting by the fireplace at night, he listened as Lila shared dreams she had never dared to voice, from wanting to see the world without fear, to hoping to one day help other children like herself. And each word, each innocent aspiration, strengthened the resolve within him to shield her from harm, to nurture her growth, and to embrace the unexpected role of guardian, mentor, and protector, while simultaneously allowing himself to be vulnerable, to trust, to feel fully the depth of connection that was no longer a fleeting moment but a living, breathing bond. And though he knew that Victor Kane might return, that the dangers tied to her past were far from resolved, Damian also knew that together, they were stronger, that love and trust could forge shields far more potent than any security system or wealth, and that in the laughter, the lessons, the quiet nights, and the shared stories, they had found something neither had anticipated. A family, built not by blood, but by courage, care, and an unbreakable bond. And as the mansion settled into the soft glow of evening, shadows stretching across walls that had once felt empty and cold, Damian Hale allowed himself to hope, to believe that even in a world of cruelty and greed, the power of humanity, kindness, and love could prevail, that a little girl's courage and a man's heart could rewrite destinies, heal wounds, and create a sanctuary in which fear was replaced by trust, laughter, and unshakable connection. And as Lila fell asleep in the safety of her new home, dreaming of brighter days, Damian silently vowed that no darkness, no villain, no past trauma would ever take away the light they had built together, because in her survival and joy, he had rediscovered the true meaning of life, love, and purpose, and nothing, not money, power, or fear, could ever diminish that. Would Victor Kane return to shatter their newfound peace, or could Damian and Lila's bond withstand the coming storm? The first light of dawn broke over the mansion, casting a warm, golden glow across the gardens that had once been silent and unfeeling, and Damian Hale stood at the window surveying the tranquility that now blanketed the estate, his heart still racing from the final confrontation with Victor Kane, who had finally been vanquished, stripped of power, influence, and the ability to harm Lila Grace ever again. And as he watched her run barefoot across the lawn, laughter spilling like music, a radiant reminder of resilience and innocence, he felt a profound sense of relief and gratitude wash over him, because the little girl who had once trembled in the storm, soaked and alone, was now safe, cherished, and free from the chains of fear that had haunted her for far too long. And in that moment, Damian understood that this was more than a victory over a cruel man. It was a triumph of love, trust, and humanity, the kind of connection that could transform not just a life, but an entire soul. And as he entered the room where Lila had curled up after breakfast, a blanket draped over her shoulders, the firelight dancing across her golden hair and bright eyes, she looked up at him and whispered softly, "Thank you, for seeing me when no one else did." And Damian felt his chest tighten, warmth spreading through every fiber of his being, because the truth was far deeper than gratitude, far more intimate than words could convey, and he bent down to hug her tightly, feeling her small arms wrap around him with trust so complete it left him breathless, and he murmured, "No, Lila. you saved me," knowing in that instant that their bond was unbreakable, a thread of love, courage and mutual healing that no shadow, storm or villain could ever sever. And the mansion, once a fortress of steel and glass, now pulsed with life, echoing with laughter, whispered secrets, and the quiet comfort of safety. The walls no longer cold but alive with warmth, care, and the invisible threads of affection weaving every corner into a sanctuary, a place where dreams could flourish, fears could vanish, and every day promised hope and joy. And as Damian walked with Lila through the sunlit halls, showing her the treasures of books, music, and gardens, he realized that he had learned more from her resilience and innocence than all the lessons money and power had ever taught him. That love, in its purest, most selfless form, had opened his heart to vulnerability, tenderness, and the courage to protect someone entirely for the sake of their happiness. And together, they explored the mansion as if it were a world reborn, her laughter bouncing off the walls like wind through the trees, her imagination turning every corridor into a castle, every window into a secret passage, and Damian found himself joining her, playing, teaching, listening, learning and healing in a rhythm of life that no contract, boardroom or fortune could ever replicate. And as night fell, the two sat by the fire, sharing stories of the past, hopes for the future, and quiet moments of reflection, their silhouettes dancing in the glow. And Damian felt the depth of gratitude for every trial, every storm, every fear they had survived together, because without them, he would not have discovered the extraordinary courage, kindness, and wisdom that resided in a 7-year-old heart, nor the capacity for love that had lain dormant within his own. And as Lila leaned against him, eyes heavy with sleep but sparkling with trust, he promised himself silently that he would never allow the darkness of the world to touch her again, that he would shield her, nurture her, and honor the bond that had saved them both. And when she finally drifted into peaceful slumber, the mansion echoed with silence that was no longer empty, but full of life, warmth, and the unspoken truth that humanity, compassion, and love could conquer even the deepest scars, that protection was not merely a duty but a gift freely given, and that in the intertwining of their lives, Damian and Lila had discovered a home not defined by walls or wealth, but by the tenderness, care, and boundless affection that had transformed loneliness into family, fear into joy, and survival into the promise of endless possibilities. And as he watched the first stars appear above the estate, Damian felt a quiet certainty, a profound peace, that the storms of the past had given way to a life reborn, a heart awakened, and a love that would endure. And in the embrace of this newfound family, he knew that no shadow, no villain, no storm could ever dim the light they had ignited together, the light of trust, courage, and the limitless power of a heart fully open to humanity. And with that realization, he whispered softly into the night, "We are home." And the mansion, now truly alive with love and laughter, seemed to agree, wrapping them both in warmth, safety, and the certainty that kindness, care, and love could indeed transform the loneliest hearts into something extraordinary. Damian and Lila's journey ends on a heartwarming, tearful note, showing that love, humanity, and kindness can heal the deepest wounds, create family, and transform lives forever.